Hi everyone, this is David and welcome to the Week 3 Fireside Chat for Educational Leadership 655, Pupil Services and Non-Discrimination with Viterbo University. This week begins Monday, February 7th and concludes on Sunday, February 13th. A week 2 recap. Continue to make those posts every week and they don't have to be long, 3-4 sentences. Be concise, but make sure to keep posting to class. Our first discussion question about the upset parent who left the voicemail for you. That was really to get at some of the deeper issues around non-discrimination, harassment, bullying, and then also bullying laws in Wisconsin. So the parent is making this allegation that her child was the recipient of bullying. Per Wisconsin Act 309, that requires schools to implement bullying prevention and then also investigate bullying. So those procedures needed to be in place all the way back in 2010. So it's likely this is already ingrained in your district's policy, your Board of Education policy, and then also your protocols. So a question, would you transcribe the parent's message? There was a lot of detail in that. So I think there's value in transcribing that message. I probably wouldn't do that for a lot of voicemails, but in this case, because it does seem that you're going down the path of a bullying investigation, I might consider transcribing that message. Who's in charge of the investigation? So this was a call left at night. It's possible the parent called you, the principal, the counselor, the superintendent, board members, who knows? So you need to find out who's been contacted and is this your role? Is the parent trying to go above the building right to district office? So how does that look in your district for investigations? Is this your role? Is it the role of the principal or the principal's designee at the building? What are bullying or harassment education and prevention lessons provided by counselors or teachers? And anything connected to PBIS. It could be that your Board of Education or your superintendent become aware of something like this, and they say, well, what are we doing in the district for bullying prevention activities? And then you can have a scope and sequence and say, well, here's what we do at elementary with our counselors, case managers, teachers. Here's how it's integrated with our PBIS system. And here's, as we go into middle school, high school. And so we'll get into that more later in class, but to make sure that you have documentation on professional development with bullying and harassment. And also that you're reintroducing that sometimes with your principals and with your staff. So Act 309, this is kind of a quirky part of Act 309. It does not specifically address cyberbullying, although by now most districts have amended their policies to address cyberbullying. But you want to be aware of that if your district addresses cyberbullying within their bullying and harassment and non-discrimination policies or not. And if they don't, I would say look around at other districts that do that. We had the second question, that was making teachers aware of IEPs and student support plans. So the question is, how's that facilitated, especially now during a pandemic? A number of you mentioned IEPs at a glance, and I think that's very useful. A number of programs such as Skyward, right, they generate those for you. But let's think about that a little deeper as far as we have this original IEP document for the student, which, several pages, very in depth. And then we're condensing it down into like a one-page document. Is there something that's lost in translation with that? Is there some kind of discrimination process to take this robust document and pare it down and give it to a teacher and say, here, this is what you need to follow? Because we largely know that teachers aren't going back to that original IEP document. So there's a question there of what goes into that IEP at a glance? what is left out, how does that impact the child of what's left out of there. And I guess this whole risk of oversimplifying the IEP for the convenience of staff. And I get it, right? Because staff, there's a lot going on. So it's something to be aware of and to sample as a pupil services director, an IEP or behavior intervention plan, or a counseling plan, or if a student is asking or has a plan to go to a different place in the building when they're experiencing anxiety, something like that. That those plans are very clear. And then what's given to the teacher also is representing the core of that larger plan or discussion. Did a great job noting that substitute teachers need to be aware of the IEP at a glance, other support documents, behavior intervention plan. So just doing an audit of that as a pupil services director, or again, could be an allergy plan, could be IEP at a glance, behavior intervention plan, 504 other support plans, and that those are in place and teachers are aware of those. Exempting students with disabilities from safety instruction and drills. So those of you in the fall 651 class, we talked about this. So this will be the second time that we've gone through this. This seems to have leveled off. Maybe 3-4 years ago, there was more of this happening in Wisconsin and across the country, where IEP teams or just buildings in general would allow students to be exempted from participating in safety instruction or safety drills. And again, a lot of that was well-intentioned, saying, the alarms and the sirens and everything is too overwhelming for some students. It introduces trauma. So I get it, but right at the same time, if that's going on, we have to figure out, how do we still provide our students and not discriminate against them because they have a disability? How do we provide them safety instruction? Because if something authentically happened, they need to be able to participate in whatever safety measure is implemented. Tim made a great post, and he was talking about, with our warning alarm and strobes, those can be traumatizing to children. They can. They're traumatizing to adults. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, they were overwhelming for me in most of the buildings that I worked at. So we think about young kids, we think about students with disabilities, sensory, and it is a lot. The National Fire Protection Agency is part of this movement to change the way that alarms and strobes are in schools, to go with voice evac alarms. So basically you're getting voice directions over a PA or an alarm. So you're not having an alarm, it's telling you what to do, or exit the building. Color strobes instead of the white strobe. So these are things actually which are being put into new schools. The Spina Bifida Association recommends that spina bifida students be exempt from fire drills because of sound sensitivity. So there's this movement to say, well, maybe we can make the drills less frightening, right? We don't have to go with hyper-realistic intruder drills and things like that. But still, like, the horns and the lights are pretty overwhelming and can introduce trauma. So it's unlikely your school is going to take your recommendation and retrofit the entire building. But anytime there's new construction, as a pupil services director, be involved in that discussion and go and visit some of the new school buildings in Wisconsin which have these measures in them. Week 2 student post, Tiffany shared that students in her setting self-advocate for accommodations. So that is excellent. I expect we're going to see increased emphasis on student mental health and students advocating for breaks. And we know breaks prevent breakdowns. That's scientifically proven. But that won't be accepted by everyone. Some staff will hold to the position, well, the student just needs to work through this. They need to understand where their envelope, their threshold is, and how to break through that. So it is going to require professional development. It's going to take listening, support, but it's also going to take directive from either the administration or pupil services to make sure that students feel comfortable asking for supports that they are entitled to through their IEP 504 or possibly other building support plans. Lindsay J. Lindsay wrote that teachers sometimes just glance over the IEPs at a glance. Maybe that's why they're called IEPs at a glance. Oh, here it is. And then they put them in a folder until the next IEP meeting. So to improve understanding and implementing of IEPs, her school built in collaboration time between regular education and special education teachers during PLCs. So absolutely, sometimes we got to go macro. We've got to look at the schedule. So do we have some common planning time? Do we have PLC time where we can talk about these things? So that's great. That's systems thinking. Whitney mentioned a teacher intentionally not complying with the student's IEP, and that checking in with that teacher in a supportive way resolved the matter. So good job, Whitney. And I shared an experience in response to that. I made a post and shared when I was an administrator working with a smaller district. We had a speech language, a pathologist who wasn't working with a new student in the district, a young student who had multiple needs, including a high medical profile. And so when I sat down with the SLP and said, well, help me to understand what's happening, the SLP just started to cry and said, I love my job. I've been here, a number of years, and this person had, always delivered with fidelity. But she said, I'm not familiar with the AAC, augmentative communication system that this child came with, which was very complex. The child came from a bigger district. This was a smaller district. They hadn't served a student with this level of needs profile in a long time. So the SLP just said, I'm having a hard time learning this. I don't know, I don't know who to go to. And so it just felt like she was letting the student down. And so as an administrator, right, needing with Pupil Services, supporting that person with a team, convening the team, we're working together as a team with this child and matching professional development up, getting someone in who was an expert in AAC, contacting the previous district, making those connections, and then things got back on track. So it wasn't in that case that someone didn't want to serve the student. It was that they didn't know how, like the professional development hadn't matched. But if you did ever run into a situation, right, where someone just is not willing to follow the IEP, then as an administrator, that needs to be a non-negotiable. Either we'll provide the professional development or that person will have to change their mindset. There is no opt-out of following an IEP. Marietta offered a step-by-step response to an upset parent. What might you do to ensure that those steps? So it was awesome. So you went here's the steps and the bullet points, really well put together. So how would you help ensure that that was consistent across your principals in your school, across your counselors and other people facilitating an investigation? Or if you weren't there for a week, that someone else would be able to do that same process. So I guess, how do you ensure reliability across schools, including documentation? So again, if this was to happen in one school versus another, the documentation would be fairly similar across those schools. Leah mentioned that she would review Skyward or EduClimber for any documented office discipline data for Susie or Jeffy. And our question about Susie and Jeffy. So I like that step of going in and looking at the data, trying to identify if there are patterns. I'm going to add to that. Site-based management can be a challenge for inter-rater reliability. One school might have very detailed entries if there's a Susie and Jeffy incident. Another school might be more informal in the way that they approach it. And maybe it's more anecdotal. So these records aren't entered into Skyward or EduClimber. And so the problem with those anecdotal notes or that philosophy is that you don't have trend data, right? What if this is the 8th time that Jeffy has exhibited this behavior? Maybe in one school, all 8 of those incidents would be documented and you'd be able to pull them up. But another school where things are handled in a more informal process, maybe there's nothing in EduClimber or Skyward. So if we don't create the entries, if we don't create those behavioral records, we're kind of discriminating against the student, right? That because we're not providing where staff would look at this and see a pattern and say, oh, maybe we need to do a referral. Maybe there are supports. There's things that we need to put in place for Jeffy, because this seems to be a pattern of behavior, versus looking and saying, it seems like this is maybe the first time this happened. And so, or maybe you're going to look at that and find trend data that's happening throughout the student body. In that case, the counselors would be able to come in and offer instruction that would be matching what is being presented by the students, maybe bullying behavior. So that's the important thing with this, again, is making sure that the documentation takes place. And because this is a bullying situation, that we have investigated it, and that those records exist, and that they follow the student up, and they don't follow the student as a means to, again, discriminate against the student. It's a means to have those records to inform services that might benefit that student. A look ahead to week 3. All right, week 3 out there. Collaboration with other districts, CESAs, and agencies. So pooling resources for professional development, also sharing your protocols. Think of this in terms of, poverty, support, bullying support, mental health needs. What might be trainings that your district could collaborate with a neighboring district or 3 neighboring districts, do a little consortium, maybe sharing of some forms. What does that look like? How can you become more efficient in that pupil services area? What would be the benefit of having your counselors meet for a half day with counselors in 2 of your neighboring districts? Your SWOT assignment: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. So you just need to do bullet points for that. Community health needs assessment. Be aware of it. It's something where the hospital that serves your area, or hospitals, this is something they're required to do. They should have somebody from the school district on their committee. As you bring up these online, you'll see that some do and some don't. But the hospital is supposed to understand and provide supports for mental health, for poverty, alcohol, tobacco, other drugs. So if you're not part of that in your area, in your county where this community health needs assessment is happening, ask to be a part of that. I think in La Crosse, up in the Adams Friendship area, I pulled up some of them and I saw school people who were represented, either counselors or special education director, pupil services, principal. Other places, no, it's just the counties that have medical representation and so forth on there, nobody from the school. So be aware of that. As a pupil services director, you want to have your seat at that table. What pupil services resources are available from your CESA? So what does your CESA offer versus what you need? Mental health services is an example. So as you look at mental health services, looking at training staff maybe in behavioral supports, interfacing with outside agencies, training new staff, whatever it might be in this pupil services realm, right? In this pupil services realm, what does your CESA offer? And then what do you need? And if you need something your CESA doesn't offer, tell the CESA, right? Say, this is a service we need, and can you provide this for us? That's something I did as a director with some other directors in CESA that I worked with. We went, and for a while here was the CESA menu of services that you'd kind of pick off of. And we said, there are other things on here that we need. And one was mental health, education for staff, suicide prevention, training for staff. So those areas then became something where the CESA said, yeah, we will, we'll provide those. Read Chapter 4 of School of Errors and then also Chapter 25. Both of those reflect on institutional knowledge, how it's transferred in your district with more turnover in administration, in staff. How does that knowledge get from one person to the next? Think about new staff when they come in, how are they made aware of bullying and harassment and non-discrimination practices, and maybe allergy plans, 504 plans. How about students? How about families? How are they made aware of services, matters of equity? How are they made aware of services that the school has, maybe with outside groups, such as the Boys and Girls Club, lunches during Christmas break or during summer? So how does this happen? How does this happen? And then also that you have equity development for new staff. So making sure that, okay, we did this training 2 years ago. Well, since then and now, we've had a 30% turnover in staff. So how are the new staff receiving the professional development? And how do they understand these behavior intervention plans? How do they understand, the IEP at a glance? I guess, what's the induction for staff and also students and for parents? All right, thanks everybody.